All right.
So this week we are looking at Genesis, from Genesis 12 to 50, so the second half of Genesis.
Okay. Second 3/4.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so basically what we saw last week was the fall and the implications of the fall, which massive, because the consequences for sin is death, and the snake lied and he said, surely you will not die, and they and we see in the even though they didn't die immediately, there was an immediate disconnect from God, and I guess real death is not being in relationship with God. But then we read in all the genealogies, and he lived, and he died, and he died, and he died, and that just emphasizes over and over again that what God said was true and what the serpent said was false. And that then ended up in being meaning judgment for the whole world in the flood. And in the flood we see that there was like a decreation and then a new creation again. And then we had Noah and him kind of fallen again. He was given the same commands as Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, but then he ate or drank wine. There was shame and nakedness again, and then the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent spread again. So there's two lines. There's those who are obedient and want to follow God, and there are those who are opposed to God. And we see this play out in the whole rest of the Bible, that the seed of the woman, which was promised in Genesis 3:15, are going to be in enmity. That's the word. Enmity with the seed of the serpent. So those who are chosen by God are always going to be in opposition to those who reject God. And that is played out in all sorts of situations in the whole rest of the Bible. And so we get to Abraham, and he is given a promise and a calling in Genesis 12, sorry. So Genesis 12 verses 1 to 3, we did see this briefly last week. He was given a promise. So can someone read that out? Just Genesis 12, 1 to 3.
Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Okay, so God actually calls Abraham from where he is, and he asks that Abraham trusts him, and he says that he's going to take him to a new place where he is going to worship God freely, and that God is going to be providing for him. And the three things, or the three parts of this promise, land, children, or to become a great nation, and blessing, are basically the point-by-point counterpart of what the curses in the fall were, where they were in Genesis 3. Basically, there was enmity between the beast and, there was this promise in the middle. The serpent is cursed, so there's cursing. And he's to eat dust. And then there's this promise in the middle of it that there will be the offspring of the woman is going to crush the offspring of the serpent. And then when we look at the woman and the man, there's discord in relationship and pain in childbearing. So there's going to be difficulties to produce children. So this seed that's promised, there's going to be problems in that coming about. And also the earth is cursed. So it's going to be hard for them to, plant. It's going to be hard for them to reap and sow and reap and eat. And then there was death. But when we get to Genesis 12, we see that there's blessing instead of cursing. There is a great nation. So this seed is promised, and not just one seed, but lots. And they'll be in a land. And it says in verse 3, I will bless those who bless you. Him who dishonors you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So there's going to be blessing, there's going to be all the peoples of the earth are going to receive this blessing in some way, and it's going to take place in a land that God is going to provide. So it's like it is basically the reversal of Genesis chapter 3, but this promise it's voiced here, started Genesis chapter 3. At the same time as the fall, the promise was already there, but it's voiced. And as we go through the whole Bible, this promise is developed, and we are given more information about how it's going to come about. But this is kind of like the very basics of the promise. Well, it's a slight expansion of what we heard in Genesis chapter 3. So an expansion of Genesis chapter 3 is that through Abraham, this is going to happen. And he is going to have, or his line is going to bear this seed of the woman. And God is going to use him to bless the whole earth. And if we remember what God's purpose was in the beginning, was to have his image spread over the whole earth. This is going to be accomplished through the seed of the woman, who is now going to be seed of Abraham. And they were cast out of the garden, but God is going to bring them back to a place where he will provide for them, to a land that he is going to be sovereign over them. They will be great. They will be a great nation, and their name will be great, which is a little bit of a contrast with what happened in the Tower of Babel, where people were trying to make their own name great, and God brings them down. And here he calls Abraham and says, I will make your name great. So God is the one who makes people's names great or not. People can try and make their name great, but that isn't going to work. So basically, from Genesis chapter 12 to the end, we get the development of these promises, but with the big problem of that Sarah can't have children. God's made this promise to Abraham that through him, all the nations are going to be blessed, and he's going to have he's going to have a great nation, or a great nation is going to come from him. and yet his wife is barren. So she can't have children. And many years go by. So if we think Abraham is maybe in his 70s, I've got the exact ages somewhere written down, in his 70s when he's called. And by the time he actually, or Sarah actually has a baby, he's 99. So it's actually quite a long time that he is depending on God for his promises. And as we read during all of these chapters from 12 through to where Isaac is born, we see that Abraham goes up and down in his ability to trust God. And it is. Yeah, especially when you're already kind of past the age of childbearing when you're given the promise. And so we see that even though God has set this promise on this person and he responds in faith, that faith isn't perfect. And we see how many times, and the Bible doesn't cover up how many times he makes a mess of things and does things in his own way and in his own strength, thinking that his way is best, and it goes wrong. And how God protects him. So you have incidences where he puts in jeopardy this promise because he says Sarah's his sister and Pharaoh takes her, but then God protects her in that situation in spite of Abraham's lack of faith. He does it twice. Like you'd think he'd learn the first time, but he does it again. But then you see other episodes where he has great faith. When he takes 300 people and goes against armies of like five kings, like five massively big, strong kings, and he defeats them because he knows that God is with him. And it's this idea of the seed of the serpent being crushed by the seed of the woman, and that's Abraham is the seed of the woman, and those other kings who are opposing Abraham are seed of the serpent, and God just crushes them before his feet. So
we all seed of Eve, like
yes.
like.
Yes, every human is physically descended from Adam and Eve, correct? But spiritually, we're either going to be for God or against God. And so basically he's saying all of those who are for God are seed of the woman, and all of those who are against God are seed of the serpent. Like no humans actually physically came from the serpent.
No.
So it's this spiritual understanding of what's happening. And as we'll see later on in the Pentateuch, you can be the seed of Abraham, like come from Abraham and still be seed of the serpent because you oppose God. Yeah. And in fact, we see it in these immediate chapters in the patriarchs, because we have we get past Isaac and we get Jacob and Esau. One of them is seed of promise and one of them ends up being seed of the serpent. They separate, they oppose each other. So we see this, that there is struggle and fights between brothers. And that continues to the end of Genesis, and it's only when there's forgiveness that the family is joined together again. And it's only through forgiveness and self-sacrifice that we see that right at the end, and that obviously points to Jesus. In Genesis 15. So in Genesis 12, we get this initial promise. And then in Genesis 15, we have God making like an official covenant. And this takes form of the traditional covenants that were made in those times. So what they would do is they would split animals in half. So they would be like animal sacrifices, but what would happen is the animals would be split in half, so they die. And what the parties did was they would walk together in between the split animals and say, we're making this covenant, and if I don't fulfill my side of the covenant, may what happened to these animals happen to me. So they're basically saying, if I don't fulfill my part of this agreement, then I should die. Okay, so when we get to God making this covenant with Abraham, let's read what happens. So Abraham, in the first few verses of chapter 15, is still without a child, and he's saying, oh, I don't have an heir, my servant's going to inherit. But God again makes the promise that he is going to give him a son. And then from verse, and that he's going to take him and give him the land. And God says in chapter 15, verse 9, can someone read 9 through to the end of the chapter?
So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite of each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace, and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, the smoking fire pot with a blazing torch, and here and passed between pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, said, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the land of the Canaanites, Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites.
Beautiful, well done. Lots of fun names. What's happening here? We've got the animal sacrifices. We've got Abraham fast asleep to the side, and who's walking through between the animals? Yeah, so this representation of God in the fire pot and the flaming torch is God, and what's he doing? He's taking on both sides. So he's saying, this covenant I'm going to fulfill, and I'm going to fulfill your side, and I'm going to fulfill my side. So God takes on the whole of the covenant because he actually knows that Abraham can't do it. And this will be reflected, like some of the images and the language used points forward to, or when you get to Exodus, we'll look back at when God makes the covenant at Sinai. And so God is basically saying, you can't do this. I'm the only one that can do it. And I have to be the one that fulfills it because you are incapable of fulfilling it. And in the very next chapter, what does Abraham do?
Try plan B.
Yeah. So he's just had this covenant and God's promised him that everything that he said is going to happen. But Abraham, for some reason, decides, nah, this isn't going to work. And Sarah is obviously fed up with waiting. And she goes, I've got an alternate plan. What should Abraham's position be when she comes up with this plan? She said, no, we trust God, right? And so if we look at verse 3, it says, Abraham's wife, and now look carefully at the language, took Hagar, her servant, and gave her to Abraham, her husband, as a wife. So what does that remind us of? Yeah, exactly the same language. She took and gave. It kind of, when you read it, it seems fairly ambiguous that, oh, well, they did this and, you know, it's written in the Bible, so therefore, oh, it can't be too wrong. But the way it's written actually indicates to us that this was simple. This wasn't the right thing to do. They were not trusting God. They were doing their own thing in just exactly the same way that Adam and Eve did their own thing in the garden. And yet, God is so kind that he doesn't overlook it, but he in chapter 17, comes back again and reminds Abraham of what he's promised and gives him the sign of circumcision. So there's this symbol of circumcision that indicates that Abraham and his offspring are going to be trusting in God. God, you know, in spite of Abraham's failing, he is going to make sure this is going to come about. Just as he is the one that walked through and made the covenant, he's the one that's going to bring this about. He promises again that Isaac's going to be born, and finally at the end of chapter 18, we see that, we get Lot first and then the birth of Isaac. So there's this, there's two intermissions in between the call of Abraham and the birth of Isaac, and it's these two episodes with Sodom and Gomorrah when Lot is separated from Abraham. First episode, Abraham rescues him, and in the second episode we see that God rescues Lot again but destroys those cities. So we see Abraham interceding. Abraham intercedes for the righteous in those cities. He's actually quite happy for God's judgment to come upon the wicked, but he doesn't want the righteous to be judged. And in the end, only one person, well, 3 people are actually saved, and we get the picture that they're not particularly righteous, are they? They're connected with Abraham, but they're not righteous. but because God is gracious, he saves them. And so then he destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. We get another episode. So again, you can see a chiasm here in that when Abraham is called, we get these promises. Then they go to Egypt, and he gives his wife over to a different person. In chapter 20, that happens again. Then you've got the 2 episodes of Sodom and Gomorrah, and right in the middle is God's covenant with Abraham. And then as Isaac is born, and then the next big thing that God asks Abraham to do is give up this one son that has finally come.
Sorry, I totally missed the chiasm there.
I need
Just
get
the
it out.
picture,
Yes, a picture of it.
Well, no, I remember what a chiasm is.
Yeah.
I just missed what the events were.
Let me just get big Genesis as now, because there's like quite a few in Genesis, but so we've got the blessing of Abraham, land, seed, and blessing, and corresponding to that is the birth of Isaac, because he's the fulfillment of that. And then we've got the 2 sister fibs between that. Then we've got Lot in between that. Like so, sister fib 12, 10 to 20, sister fib 21 to 18. Then in chapters 13 and 14, we've got Lot. 18 and 19, we've got Lot. And then we've got the covenant. But right in the middle is this sinful episode.
In
16. Yeah. So in spite of the sin right in the middle, God still fulfills the promise that he made to Abraham in chapter 12 when Isaac is born. And so Abraham is promised that you will have your descendants will be a great nation. All Abraham sees is one son. Actually, he lives long enough to see grandsons, 2 grandsons.
It's twice as many.
Yes, if it goes on exponentially doubling like that.
Well, Jacob did his.
Well, he did. Yeah, also not in the best way possible, but yeah. So we see fallen people listening to God and trusting in God, and God at work fulfilling his promises. And so when we get to Abraham sacrificing Isaac, we have a picture of Abraham who is trusting that somehow God is going to bring his son back from the dead. If he's asked him to sacrifice him, Abraham has to have reasoned that if God has made this promise, and this is the son that he promised, and this is definitely the son he promised because God said so, somehow God is going to work out this situation so that the son is still there to carry on, because without the son, the promise is defunct. Like there's no promise. It ends here if the son doesn't continue. And so it's very interesting the way this is structured and written. in chapter 22 as they, there are chiasms within this. So at the beginning, he lifts up his eyes. At the end, he lifts up his eyes and sees the ram. In the middle is the provision of the substitute. And so we get this big picture of Abraham giving up what God has promised him and receiving it back again. And we get pictures of on the third day, there's this substitution. So the ram is substituted for the son, and there is an offering. Now Isaac isn't a little baby. He's older. He's walking up the hill with his father. So he actually has to at some point be willingly lying on that offering. So there's all these pictures in this. It says a boy, we don't know how. I mean, Abraham's pretty old. If he really didn't want to be in that situation, I'm pretty sure he could have overpowered his father in one way. Like, he's a young boy. Abraham's an old man. The boy's carrying up the wood. So he's not like a baby. He's not 5. He's probably about 14 or 15. He's carrying the wood up the hill to make this offering to God. And so Abraham is obviously in giving his son faith, or you know, his faith. The faith of Abraham is being adopted by Isaac, because he's there too. He's carrying up the wood. He's lying on there, ready to be offered. If he was unwilling, he would have run away, and he could have. So obviously Isaac in some way is trusting that God is going to do something miraculous as well. So here we get a beautiful picture that points perfectly to Jesus in both Abraham's faith and Isaac's faith, because he gives his one and only son. He is the one and only son, and he willingly offers up himself somehow. We're not told all the details, and we're not told about any arguments that they might have had, but we are told Abraham said God will provide. When the son asks, well, where's this sacrifice coming from? He says God will provide, and God does. So, yeah, all of this points to Jesus, obviously, and his substitution for us as God's one and only son. So it points actually to the way that God is going to fulfill the covenant that he promised that he would fulfill by actually offering his own son as a sacrifice. It also points to the substitutionary nature of the sacrificial system that's going to be established in Leviticus. And then the promises are repeated again. Your offspring shall, in verse 17, surely I will bless you, surely I'll multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand on the seashore. Your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And so, you know, we get this repetition of offspring, which again is the same word as seed, your seed. And so that's reminding us of the promise in Genesis 3. And that God is working out his plan and his sovereign plan, and he is miraculously doing this. So Abraham trusts in this idea of God bringing life from death. obviously the picture of barrenness and then giving birth is life from death as well, because in if we think about it, Sarah's body is dead. She can't produce a baby, and yet a baby is given to her, and life comes from that dead womb of hers. And so God brings life out of death. So Abraham is trusting here that God will bring life out of death. And then that is what Jesus is going to do. He's going to bring life out of death. It's resurrection. So there are lots and lots of chapters going through all of these patriarchs, or what we call them, the patriarchs. And the way that they live and what happens with them, it makes us think, my goodness, these people don't deserve God's favor because they're doing awful things. They're doing sinful things, horrible things to each other, to other people. And yet, in spite of their inability to do what is right, inability to trust God, God is still working through his simple people to bring about his promises. So we have Jacob, Isaac is the only one who stays in the promised land. Is faithful with one wife.
People often say she's
No, well, actually he does.
oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah. Yeah.
He does.
Moral of the story, don't get a good wife. I'm very nervous about it.
Yeah, I think this is just a lack of trust that God will protect them. I mean, and in spite of their inability to trust God, God still protects them.
Yeah.
But yeah. So even this one guy who was faithful and had one wife and stayed in the land, didn't go anywhere else, because that's what God said to do. Even he had his moments, and in the end, he has favoritism.
Yeah.
And so instead of trusting that God would determine who is going to be the one that gets the blessing, he tries to give the blessing to the other one. And the way this all goes, it pans out, is people are trying to manipulate God's word, and in the end God's word is sovereign anyway. They could have avoided a whole lot of trouble if they'd have just said, this is the promise, this is who it's going to, and not had this whole favoritism and sinful.
At least with Isaac, it was Rebecca who got the promise from God, wasn't it? Who was told that he will serve the older. I don't think Isaac gets a direct word on that.
Well,
I mean, presumably.
where does she get the word from? Because
she's pregnant.
Yeah, so let's just read that because it's interesting. The birth of Isaac. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, so chapter 25 verse 21, because she was barren. The Lord granted his prayer and she conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. Where is she going to inquire of the Lord? Who's she going to talk to ask? So it's either Abraham or Isaac, isn't it? Because they're the people who have the strong relationship. She may have done it directly. She might have prayed. So the Lord said to her, she could have prayed, and this is what happened. Surely she would have shared this.
Yeah, you would think so. I mean,
if it's either her receiving this and she should have shared it with her husband, or it's her husband saying this is it, or Abraham saying this is what God says. So there should have been an acknowledgement that they all knew this is what God said, and yet he favors the one that's not meant to get the blessing. She is trying to procure the blessing for the one that's the right one, because that's what God said. And it's well, yeah, and then there's this favoritism as well. So this sibling rivalry, this it just continued. We saw it with Cain and Abel, we see it with the children of Noah, and then we see it here again, that, you know, humans, our vertical, our horizontal relationships are broken, and we can't get them right, and we need this vertical relationship to be right. And so then Jacob, who gets the promise by grasping at it, spends the next however many years, like 40 years or 20 years, actually rebelling against God. Like, he goes to this other country, he marries 2 women, God, and then you know, he knows the story. He's got to know the story of what happened with Hagar and how that wasn't appropriate. And yet he is very happily taking on the servant girls of his wives, like, you know. So he's all he seems to be living in rebellion,
being pushed around by his wives.
That's does.
That's what it's like.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, here's my servant. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, here's my son. Oh, okay, seems as you made me. Yeah, and so, you know, he's so undeserving of these promises that God has repeatedly made. And then it's like he's struggling against God all this time, even though he was grasping for the promise and tried to do it by his own way. Does he really want the promise? Because he does all this stuff. And it's not until he actually goes back, things get so bad with his father-in-law that, you know, he needs to go back. But he's worried about his brother who wants to kill him. And it's not until he wrestles with God in chapter 32 that he finally submits to God. Like, he spends a whole night wrestling against God. It's like it's a representation of all of those years where he's just been doing his own thing, doing it his own way. And here he finally submits, because God could have just did what he did at the end, at the beginning of that, but he allows him to push and push and push all night until he finally submits. And then he recognizes who God is. He says, I've seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. But he doesn't come out of it unscathed. He gets an injury. He lives. It says, to this day, chapter 32, verse 32, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh. In memory of this injury that he got in pushing away God, trying to, you know, force a blessing from God when he already had the blessing. In fact, all the things that he was doing with his goats and the sticks, like, he was thinking, oh, I'm doing this clever thing, and it was all the time, God bless me. He was pushing at God, asking for a blessing. God had already blessed him. It was like Adam and Eve. You know, they were already in God's image, and yet they're trying to make themselves like God. And so here he's already got the blessing, and he's pushing for God to bless him. And he needs to submit to God, which he finally does. All sorts of goings on with the descendants of, so, you know, he has 12 sons, and they all fight. And we get a whole lot of different stories, and we finally get Joseph, who out of all the 12 sons seems to be the most receptive and understanding, but he's the one that suffers the most. And so we get this picture of God, Joseph having God with him in terrible circumstances, in opposition to his brothers who aren't in slavery, they're not in jail, they're free, and then they don't really seem to have God with them. Like, you know, he's got God with him in these terrible circumstances, And they're doing all these things in freedom, but they're actually without God. And so we get this comparison. It's better to have God in difficult circumstances or to be without God in, and having a good life. And it's not, and we get this picture of contrasting Joseph and Judah. Judah does despicable things as well, but it seems that after going through that experience in chapter 38, he actually he has a change in his understanding, and going from being one of the people that betrayed Joseph, he actually stands up to Joseph at the end and says, no, take me, don't take my brother. And so he's actually willingly giving up his life, basically, for his brother. And so we get these two people, we get Jacob and Joseph, and between the two of them, we find that with the self-sacrifice of Jacob and the forgiveness of, the self-sacrifice of Judah, the self-sacrifice of Judah and the forgiveness of Joseph, there's reconciliation. And it seems to be that those two things need to be tied up for there to be forgiveness. There needs to be self-sacrifice and there needs to be forgiveness offered. And repentance. So there is repentance as well at the end. So when there is this reconciliation at the end of Genesis, it's almost like a reversal of the enmity that was at the beginning. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and all his brothers, and right at the end there is reconciliation and unity. And we see that God has started fulfilling his promises. They're a big family. But at the end of Genesis, they're actually not in the land of Israel. They're not in the promised land. But the nations are being blessed through what Jacob has done, what Joseph has done in Egypt. So there's this big famine. Joseph administers things really well, and that means that people from all the nations around that are suffering from this drought and famine are all provided for because of Joseph. So there is blessing, and there is a great nation, the start of a great nation, but they're no longer in the land. They finish up Genesis outside the land. But we can see God working his plan and his promise in spite of all the barriers that, and obviously sin and sinful humans and undeserving humans being the biggest barrier. They do so many things that kind of put them at odds with what God has promised. And so at the very end of Genesis, we've got Jacob blessing his sons, and we see that in chapter 49, verse 10, this idea that there is going to be a scepter that comes from Judah, and the ruler's staff will be in his feet, between his feet, and tribute will come to him, and all the peoples will be obedient to him. So there's this picture of, there's an expansion of this idea that the nations through Abraham are going to be blessed, And here we see, or we start to see, that this is going to come through the tribe of Judah. And as we go through the Pentateuch, we're going to see how the tribe of Judah becomes quite important in leadership. Yeah. So, any questions from all of that? Let's see if there's anything else here that we need to. I think we've gone through most of it. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, God says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. After looking through Genesis, is there any way that you have seen how God has enacted this in the lives of the people in the history of Genesis? So when God says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse.
Okay. Well, you see the kings who fought against Abram. They lost.
Yep. I think you.
Oh, Joseph.
Yep. Yeah.
I mean, he ended up in a high position.
Yeah. And the Pharaoh of Egypt says, this guy, we're going to listen to him. We're going to listen because we're going to trust what his God says. And God actually provides for all of Egypt, for the Pharaoh, and for all the nations around. So yeah, great blessing comes from that, in that decision of that Pharaoh to bless Joseph. And
you see the brothers, how they suffered after they mistreated that godly one.
Yep. I think you've got Rebecca, who hears about the blessing and then goes with the servant to this person she doesn't know to be part of the blessing, and gives birth to people in the line of Jesus. So she is part of that. I mean, she's fallen and she did stupid things as well, but she actually believed, she wanted to participate in the blessing, and she became, mother of Jacob and Esau. We're going to see it more as we go through, particularly we've got one Pharaoh at the end of Genesis who blessed Jacob and Joseph and said, we'll listen to him and we'll listen to his God. And we have an immediate contrast at the beginning of Exodus, where there's another Pharaoh, and he's like, I don't want to have anything to do with this God. And so we're going to see what happens when someone opposes God in Exodus. So that's where we're headed next week. So we're going to see if we can get through the next two chapters, so units, which covers all of Exodus next week.
I don't have access to your notes yet.
Oh, okay.
Am I meant to do something?
I don't know. Can you maybe talk to Helen?
All right.
Yeah. Because she takes care of all of that. Sure. So Unit 4 and Unit 5 basically go through all of there's more chapters on Exodus. Okay, there, no, that's all right. We'll do unit 4 and 5 because it basically is covering all the way up to Sinai. And then from Sinai, we'll go from Sinai and Leviticus at the same time, which is probably to do it together. So units 4 and 5, Book of Exodus. So let me double check what the Exodus 1 to 10 is chapter. Yeah, so if you can get through up to Exodus 20, reading or listening, that would bring us from Egypt to Mount Sinai. Chapter 20 is when they give the 10 Commandments. So
It wasn't hard work listening to.
yeah,
Genesis.
yeah, it is. Yeah, and the first 20 chapters of Exodus are actually quite easy to read or listen to as well. It gets more hard going when you're reading all about the tabernacle twice, because you read about how it's ought to be and then you read about how it gets constructed. So yeah, but you don't have to worry about it. So I know you guys need to go. So is there someone who'd like to pray?
Yeah.
Yes.
Dear Lord, thank you for another opportunity to get into your word and to learn more about who you are and why you have created us. We pray that, as we go into this week, as we read Exodus and listen to it, that, you'd be working in us, that we might understand it and have questions from it, that we can get through the next 2 units next week. With good discussion and fruitful outcomes, that we would be digging deep into your word and finding out more about how it applies to us today, even though it is so old. Have a look at the Bible as this one huge interconnected text. I pray this in your name.
Amen. Want to, if you do have any questions that we didn't cover, let me know or put them in writing so that I can make sure that we go through them next time, because I know we were kind of trying to get through nice and quickly this time so you guys could get away. But if there are things that you kind of remember reading and go, actually, I've got a question about that, let me know. Because I don't want to skip over things if they're, just trying to cover the most important things today. Because Sandy's not here, often she'll bring out extra things.
Thank you very much, Jill.
That's all right, thank you.